Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Ed Kaye, the CEO of Stoke Therapeutics. We're going to have a really great discussion today about really developing novel therapeutics in disease states that generally don't get enough attention, how we develop with the end in mind, that success is not just getting regulatory approval, and how to make sure that we're putting patients first and in the center of our development process from the earliest days of development and through full commercialization. So, Ed, I'm so glad to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Kim.
To start us off, maybe if you could just give a little bit of the history of your career and how you wound up where you are today at Stoke.
It was a bit of a circuitous journey. I started out really as an academic pediatric neurologist and biochemical geneticist, and primarily, thought I would stay in academia for my entire career. What evolved is I started to really get interested in therapies for rare diseases. And I think what I appreciated, it would be very difficult to do in an academic medical center to actually develop therapies. And this was at a time when we were looking very seriously at gene therapy to the central nervous system for rare neurological diseases. So about the same time, I was called by Genzyme, and Genzyme, of course, really was the leader in rare disease and the pioneer. And Henry Chimere, who was the CEO at the time, said, what we really need now is a physician who's actually taking care of the patients that we're trying to treat. So after a lot of soul searching, I decided to go to Genzyme, and it really was a very good move because it allowed me to develop therapies for the patients that I had been treating for years. And I was very fortunate to lead teams at Genzyme for 5 different drugs that we developed, all for rare neurologic and genetic diseases. And then I went on and became chief medical officer and CEO at Stoke Therapeutics, where we developed the first therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I've been here at Stoke for almost 7 years now. And what we're focused on is, again, going after rare genetic diseases. In this case, we're going after rare epilepsy. And one of the things that is unique about our particular company at Stoke is most RNA companies are downregulating or knocking down a toxic protein. We're doing the exact opposite. We're upregulating a normal protein. And so this, for me, was an opportunity to go after diseases that previously had not been able to be addressed. And so we were able to go after dominant diseases where you're missing 50% of the protein. And by changing some of this RNA splicing, we could actually increase the amount of protein and restore it back to a normal level. And what we're seeing is really dramatic improvements, not only in seizure activity, but in cognition and behavior. And this is the first time when someone has really been able to show improvements, I think, really in cognition and behavior in a disease that was thought to be really irreversible. And so it's kind of an exciting time in medicine, and other companies are starting to do that, looking at some of these diseases that we thought were untreatable.
That's so incredible. And thinking about the various steps in your career, Ed, it sounds like you've pretty much always been focused on development of these first-in-class therapeutics. Can you give a perspective? What have you learned that makes first-in-class drug development so challenging?
Yeah, it is really hard to be the first. And one of the things that I think is interesting is you have to kind of figure out your way. There are no roadmaps or charts that you can follow. I think one of the things that is really important is when you start the process is really trying to understand the disease and what is needed. And the best way to understand that is to actually talk to the patients and to really understand what are the unmet needs that is very important for them to be addressed. And that really is, I think, the starting place. And then you see is, well, can I develop a therapy and what we call a target product profile? In other words, how good does the medicine have to be? How safe does it have to be? What's the route of administration? What will the patients tolerate? What do they want? And you have to figure out, can I actually develop a medicine that patients would use that would be really life-altering for these patients and give them something that they really need? Some of the things that we think about is, even in the rare disease, some rare diseases are actually too rare. And I think our rule of thumb is if you can't find enough patients to do a clinical study, there probably aren't enough patients to treat. And, sometimes, there's different mechanisms for a lot of the charitable foundations are working on, an N of one, trying to treat one or two patients. But for a biotech company, that's just not very practical. So one thing is understanding the epidemiology. The other thing is that we've certainly appreciated is that a lot of times the natural history of these diseases are unknown. There's a lot of literature that talks a little bit about it, but when you get down to it, you don't really understand what the natural history is. And so, for example, for our Dravet program, which is our genetic epilepsy, and we also have done this for our autosomal dominant optic atrophy program, we actually had to do a 2-year natural history study to understand, well, what happens to these patients? How fast does the disease progress? What are the instruments that you can use to test to see how the patients are doing? Do you have an endpoint that you could be used? And so it was very valuable. It takes time, it takes money, and I think I would say investors sometimes would wonder, why are you doing this? But if you don't understand the disease, it's very hard to develop a therapy unless you completely understand what's going on with these patients. So I think that would be the first step. The other thing we've learned is really sitting down with the clinicians, with the patients, and trying to understand the disease and what are the symptoms that are the most bothersome. What do you need to improve to make this therapy worthwhile for patients? So just really sitting down and understanding the needs of the patients and what needs to be addressed is really critically important. And then we go through a whole checklist of things of, what do we need to have? Do we have an animal model that we can show that our therapy is working? Do we have a regulatory pathway? What's the competition? And a lot of these things, can we actually make a drug from a manufacturing perspective? And all these things kind of go into place as we think about, can we actually address this particular disease? Is this an appropriate indication to go after? And that's all the work that has to be done before you even really start your program.
And I really appreciate a number of things you just touched on. Culminating to me is what you just described, which is what is the feasibility at every stage? And how do you make sure that you're giving value back to the patient at the end of the day? Are you giving them something back that is ultimately meaningful? Is it increased mobility? Is it reduction in seizures? How do we think about the endpoints in our trials that directly relate to the things that really matter to the patient and the caregivers and the families who are dealing with these diseases every single day? One thing I want to touch on, and it's probably related to the endpoint piece, so I'll leave this to you, but as a seasoned drug developer, how do you convince investors and your board to spend the time and money on these upfront natural history studies and the epidemiology? And to your point, this takes years to do and to do it right. I imagine it influences your endpoint and your biomarker strategy and everything that you're actually doing in your development. But can you speak a little bit about how have you really built the business case for spending the time and money up front to do it right?
Yeah, I think, one of the things is really coming up with a story to investors on why should they invest in your company for this particular indication. And it's really having a logical story of, why this is important and how it will ultimately really accelerate the drug development. And I think one of the things that's important is if you're going to develop a therapy, it really does have to be done right. It's so easy to make mistakes. And one of the things that sometimes by hurrying up, you end up taking longer. And what I mean by that is you really have to do it right. And you don't, what we're trying to do is to avoid mistakes in the clinic. And so what we're, again, one of the things as an example for Dravet syndrome, when we did the natural history, we tested the clinical endpoints and we figured out which endpoints we could use for the study. So that really saved us a lot of time, but also de-risked the program because now we know what endpoints would be important. We also knew, would the patients tolerate the study? We learned from that. And so all of that really helps you. The way I think about it is you're telling a story. You're telling a story to investors. You're asking them to give their money to develop a product that's obviously going to help patients. But they want it to be successful. So the way I look at it is how do you de-risk all of the steps in the process that make it easier for people to believe that this could work. And one of the ways is, of course, is even at the early preclinical stage. Can you show in an animal model that could predict that your drug should work in the mechanism that it is? Do you have a surrogate endpoint that shows that the drug is working on target, it's working as expected? And then, of course, there's the safety. Trying to look in, a couple of animals to make sure that before you give it to people, it's going to be safe and you're not going to have any adverse events or serious adverse events that could really completely destroy your drug development program. So again, it's all about the story. And then how do I get data to make people believe that this is a good idea and we're going in the right path? And then it's getting data points, getting people more comfortable that what you're doing seems reasonable and logical, and that you're making progress in this disease. And so it is a continuous dialogue between, I think, the investors and the patients and the physicians to make sure that everybody understands why this is important and what you're doing and why you're doing it.
It's such a great overview and a lot on this show. And I think most CEOs of biotechs are often so worried about the investors and what they're going to think and how to message to the board. One thing, Ed, that we've spoken about previously, and it really struck me, is how much you in particular and your company have really focused on the patient and have put the patient, not just in the center of drug development, but in the earliest days of drug development. And I found that incredibly unique and quite incredible in the process. Could you talk a little bit about what it means to actually drive patient-focused drug development and when should we be bringing them in? How should we be bringing them in? What are some of the lessons learned you've developed along the way?
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously for me, I was very fortunate to start my biotech career at Genzyme because Genzyme was very much a patient-focused company. So some of the things that I certainly learned along the way is really having the discussion very early with the patient advocates and really understanding what were their desires and the needs. And so what happens is you start this dialogue, I think, with the patients, and it starts very early as you think about your clinical trial design. So one of the things that we've done is we've, in fact, developed a protocol and then basically ran it past the patients. And one of the things that we look at is that, is this reasonable? Is this too burdensome? Will you be able to actually participate in the trial, or how could we make this easier? And some of the things we found of, making sure that we have quick reimbursement for travel. That was very important to patients. We found out also that for a lot of the diseases like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we needed to make sure that one or two people we would pay for someone to travel with the patients because it was burdensome for the families. And so what we try to do is, can we make it easier for the families and the patients to do the clinical trial? And that was really very, very important. The other very important part of this is once the advocacy communities have bought in that this is a good idea, they're your best supporter to get patients to come to a clinical trial. And so what we often will do is we'll give them all the information about the clinical trial because patients will ask the advocacy groups, should I do this? And what's this trial about? So try to give them as much information as possible. The other thing we do is, and I've certainly heard complaints from patient groups along the line that companies are so focused on speaking with investors and getting information out to the streets, because there's, we have all these SEC requirements that you have to get information out. But remember, the people who are most interested in your progress are the patients. So one of the things that we've tried to do very much on the same day that we have a press release or and an earnings discussion release that we have a discussion with all of the patient advocacy groups. This is what we're saying. This is why it's important. Do you have any questions? And if your, if your patients in your group have any questions, these are, some of the answers that, this is why we're doing this, so you can answer them. And, that's actually, again, it's about having trust between the patients and the advocacy groups and the company. And that also means you also have to tell them the bad news. If there is bad news, we get it out very quickly and make sure that they understand. And this is what we're trying to do to alleviate the problem. And sometimes, there's just nothing we can do, and you have to be very honest with them. But it's about that. It's all about, people forget anything we do is about relationships, whether it's with investors or patients or with the FDA. It's about, and to me, if you're always tell the truth, you never have to remember what you said the last time.
It's such a great point, and so important, especially with patients and advocacy groups where you really hope for their families. It's incredibly personal for them every time you have positive or negative news and how these programs progress. So remembering the human element is so critical in drug development. And I really appreciate how much you're doing that. Along those same lines, I'd love to hear more about how you define success for drug development, in particular for these first-in-class programs that you've been working on. It's so incredibly hard to find a successful outcome, and success isn't always just getting a regulatory approval. Can you talk through, in your mind, what does success look like for a development program in one of these really challenging to treat diseases?
I think the way I would define success is, are the patients able to use the drug that you develop for them, and do they find it really valuable? Certainly for the patients or for the families that are using it. When we think about drug development, obviously, first and foremost is registering the drug to get it approved in various different regions of the world. And one of the things that's always important is you want to make sure that if you're developing a therapy, that as many people as possible have access to it. So it's not enough just to have approval in the US. You want approval in the EU. You want approval in Japan. You want approval in South America and other, the Middle East, and making sure that all patients who could benefit from the drug have access to it. So, success is not just getting the drug registered, but you have to have information, sometimes we refer to it as a dossier, that payers will pay for it. And so in the United States, of course, we have insurance companies, but we also have the government, we have Medicaid and Medicare. And in most European countries, it is the government that pays for it. So you have to have a package of information that will allow the payers to actually pay for it. Nobody's benefiting from a therapy that's approved, but nobody can afford it, and nobody will pay for it. And so I think the success means, can you actually get it to the people out there? And one of the things that, and I learned this from Genzyme, and I did the same at Sarepta, and we're doing the same at Stoke, is how do you make sure you make it as easy as possible for patients to access your drug? And so having, we would have case managers that would work with the patients, help them fill out all the paperwork that they need for the insurance, work all the forms that have to be done. It's a lot of work. And it's also a lot of work for the physicians to fill out the forms. So we try to make it as easy as possible, because we have experts that know how to do this. That's their full-time job. They focus on making sure people get reimbursed and reauthorized. And so that can be helpful, because again, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for patients to get access to your therapy. And also, I think it's really important. We try to make sure that patients don't have a lot of out-of-pocket costs, because obviously that's really important for patients. We hear about it all the time. How do we make sure that patients have access to it, but they have to also be able to afford it. So all those things have to go into consideration.
Everything you just said sounds so idealistic in terms of how we would run a biotech. How have you built your team and your culture within the organization to really reflect all of the values that you just described, Ed?
Well, one of the things I think that is really important is for everybody in the company, and it isn't just the physicians and the clinical operation people who have really direct contact with the patients. It's everybody in the company realizing that this is a mission, and the mission is to try to develop a therapy for people who really need it. And one way of doing it is making sure that everybody in the company understands the mission and the story and why we're doing it. And one way of doing that is, we'll often have the physicians will talk to the company about the disease, and so they can understand it. More importantly, we have patients come in, and they come into the company and they talk about some of the problems and why they would really like a medicine that would help them, but just understanding what the patients are going through. And I think for me, if you have a tough day, you'll feel sorry for yourself, but you think like, whatever I'm going through, pales in comparison to what these patients have to go through every single day. And their life is so much harder than what we think our life is. And if we can do anything to help them, I think it's really getting everybody to understand that what we're trying to do is improve the lives of people who really need our help. And if you keep that in mind, and one of the sayings that Henry Tremere would always quote, he would say, good medicine is good business. And if you're making a good medicine that's really helping people, you'll figure out a way to really make it into a business. And I think that's a good lesson to always keep in mind. You don't want a Me Too drug, or a drug that just barely works and maybe it's approved, but is it really helping someone? You want to keep it in mind. The purpose of this drug is to really help patients. And if I'm really helping patients, then we'll figure out a way how to get it reimbursed and get it to patients.
I think that's probably one of the most important lessons that we can continue to remember in this industry, that good medicine makes good business, but also it doesn't have to be square peg, round hole. We can't just take a drug and then keep looking for a disease to treat. And I really appreciate all of your points about really understanding the disease up front, understanding the natural history and the epidemiology, understanding the patient and what they're dealing with, and making sure that what we're developing and how we're developing the drugs are actually helping those patients where they are and what they need in the most critical times. The last question I'd love to throw your way, Ed, is what advice you would have for somebody just moving into the biotech industry, somebody taking on their first CMO or CEO role. They're looking to build their teams. They're looking to build a program. What advice do you have for them at this stage?
Probably, I think what people forget is when you move into the CEO role, just how lonely the job is. Because at the end of the day, you are responsible for everything, and you're held accountable. And so I think it can sometimes be a little overwhelming, and sometimes people, get this feeling is that I have to make all the decisions. So one of the things I learned very early in my career is to be the last person to speak. And what I mean by that is when I'm in a room with all of my direct reports, sometimes I have a very strong feeling of what a decision should be, but I've taught myself to just be quiet and to listen to everybody in the room. And sometimes I've been really surprised how sometimes even the most junior person in the room can have the best idea. So, and if I come out very early and I have a strong feeling about what we should do, what happens, it often becomes reality. People just say, okay, the CEO wants to do it this way, so that's what we're going to do. And it's not necessarily the best decision. So I think sometimes you have to be a little humble. You have to appreciate that other people have different experiences, also have ideas, and sometimes that idea might be better than yours. So taking the time to listen to people, at the end of the day, you have to make the decision, and sometimes it'll be a different decision than what some of the members of your team want, but at least they've been heard. At least you've taken them seriously, you've listened, you've been thoughtful, and you make a decision incorporating all that information. So sometimes just being quiet and listening can be very helpful.
Wise words for sure, especially for new leaders. Ed, thank you so much for joining the show today. You've had such incredible insights and really appreciate the mindset of putting the patient first and in the center of everything you're doing. So excited to see what Stoke's going to be doing in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Kim, and appreciate it. It was very nice to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.